So My Dress-Up Darling is a thing. It's a wonderful anime with gorgeous visuals, interesting characters, and hilarious moments counterbalanced with strong emotional drama, all told in a story that's about self-discovery, falling in love, and following your passion. I said it's about self-discovery, falling in love, and following your passion. Okay, fine. The show is incredibly preoccupied with how sexy its female protagonist is. And yeah, she's really attractive. But here's the thing. All of the stuff I said about the emotional drama, interesting characters falling in love, and discovering themselves through their interactions and interests, all of that is true. And normally when people say, ooh, I watch this for the plot for a show like this, it comes across as a bit sketchy. But 100% I watch this show for the plot. Okay, like 90% for the plot, but that's still pretty high. I enjoy seeing people with interests different from my own realize that there's no shame in being excited about something, even though it might be a little strange or offbeat. And I know very little about the hobbies the characters in this show have. I like watching them teach each other about the intricacies of their hobbies. It gives me a new appreciation for what they do, and that's a big part of what drives this show, along with the budding romance between the two main characters, and of course the fact that this show is so hot for its female lead that it hurts. And yet somehow, My Dress-Up Darling has found a way to master the art of being wholesome and horny at the same time. Because these plot threads and attention to narrative make for a compelling story and characters, but goddamn if this show isn't horny as fuck. And I don't just mean the show itself, because sometimes the characters are pretty horny too.
別にやましいことしてないよ。
しちゃったりして。とか言ってみたり。
I think it's really interesting that there's a show that can play with the aesthetics of its characters in a way that's sexy while still maintaining a wonderful story. The show never crosses the line of integrity because it genuinely cares about its characters, especially Kitigawa. And while I was thinking about how the show treats Kitigawa, I realized that there are a few things that are really interesting about the show, and how it deals with the depictions and sexualization of its characters regarding how the characters understand sex, how the characters are depicted sexually, and the broader understanding and appreciation of sexualized cartoons. And so today, I want to talk about My Dress-Up Darling. Pardon my terrible Japanese pronunciation, but Sono Bisku Doro wa Kiyosoru, or The Bisque Doll I Fell in Love With, is a manga that began serialization in 2018, published by Square Enix and written by Shinichi Fukuda. The chapters were released in Young Gangan on a semi-regular schedule, and like most manga, the chapters were then collected into volumes and distributed as a full collection later on. In 2019, Square Enix announced that the manga would be translated into English under the title My Dress-Up Darling. The manga proved to be hugely popular in both English and Japanese, and so Square Enix decided that the series would be adapted into a full season of anime by the masterful people at Cloverworks Studio. The show premiered in the winter anime season of 2022 and became a breakout fan favorite and is being dubbed into English. I have no strong feelings about dubbing versus subbing. Whatever works for you is fine. I go back and forth depending on the anime, but for this one I'm watching it in Japanese with English subtitles. In case this is something you want to check out and actually care about the plot, this is your spoiler warning. All jokes aside, you should actually check this show out for the plot. Wakana Gojo is a high school loner. This is not because he's particularly antisocial, but he spends a lot of his free time working at his family business and his passion, which is making Hina dolls. These are neat, lifelike miniature Japanese dolls that have elaborately detailed costumes, makeup, and sets. Gojo's passion for the dolls is part of the reason why he keeps to himself. When he was younger, a childhood friend told him he shouldn't like Hina dolls because dolls are for girls and it's weird and creepy. This crushed Gojo, and it stunted his ability to reach out to other people because he's afraid he will be ridiculed for his interests. That is, until he literally collides with Marin Kitigawa, a vibrant and somewhat frivolous young woman who spots Gojo working on a Hina doll, sees his passion for it, and immediately expresses her amazement. Terrified, Gojo thinks she will tease him for his hobby, but the opposite happens, and Kitigawa tells Gojo not to be embarrassed or ashamed for what he's interested in. She then begins to talk about her passion, which is cosplay, and how she's been attempting to create a dress for one of her favorite characters. Gojo is underwhelmed by her sewing ability, but Kitigawa asks him if he will help her cosplay, and is filled with excitement at the prospect of becoming one of her favorite characters. Gojo is impressed with her passion and agrees to help her, only to find out that the character, Shizuku, is from an erotic visual novel.
クラブハレンチミラクルライフ2の黒井しずくたん
なんですって
But Kitigawa is undeterred and Gojo helps her and even offers to check the game out for research purposes. But he does actually treat it like research, and it turns out that erotic is putting the game lightly.
なるほど後ろはこうなっているのか
With his skill at sewing and her knowledge of cosplay and otaku culture, Gojo and Kitigawa create a wonderful recreation of Shizuku, and the pair go to an event where they have a great time and receive a lot of compliments for their work. On the way home, after having worked tirelessly for several days straight, Gojo falls asleep on the train and sleepily tells Kitigawa that she looked beautiful. Surprised, Kitigawa realizes that she's fallen in love with Gojo, only he's too oblivious to realize, but he wants to spend more time with her too and learn more about cosplay so he can get better at making Hina dolls. He also spends an entire episode taking her measurements, but we'll get to that one. Throughout the course of the show, we see Gojo and Kitigawa get closer, first through a mutual interest in clothing, and then as friends before slowly realizing their deeper feelings for each other. Or maybe not in Gojo's case, but this is an important factor in how the show depicts its characters in regards to their own sexuality. The term fan service gets thrown around as a kind of crude euphemism for when a character's body is shown for no other reason than because they're attractive, and usually because of the male fanbase. Although there are shows that are made for male-loving audiences in the same way, the trend is usually female depictions. I did a whole episode on Jessica Rabbit and how females are treated by the camera, so you can check that out because it definitely applies to My Dress Up Darling and a lot of other anime, and I think it's still relevant, but I want to focus on different aspects because of the nature of the show's narrative and characters. In the first episode, any of the shots that we get of Kitigawa that are more sexual than normal are all depicted from Gojo's point of view, and there are really only 2 that occur. I think this is because the show isn't really about sex, it's about 2 high school students that become friends and learn to share their interests and a little bit of themselves with another person. That's what's constantly being driven at and what the narrative works towards. Occasionally, someone's body or sex comes up in the plot or on screen because the show is about teenagers, and we all know that teenagers are very preoccupied with sex. It's not the focus of their lives, at least I hope not, but as they grow up and become familiar with themselves, they start to find out what they're attracted to. This is exacerbated by the fact that Gojo doesn't have any friends to speak of, let alone female ones. We can see that his first interaction with Kitigawa is very stressful for him. He has no idea how to act around her, and when he accidentally sees part of her butt, he has no idea how to feel about it. But of course he would notice her and the parts of her body that excite him. Kitigawa is clearly incredibly confident in her body, and that's not just a convenient way to explain why she's sexualized or subjected to particular framing. Her clothes and makeup are done in a way that is considered flashy in Japanese culture. I'm not going to get into it right now because it's a cultural thing and it's not the point I'm making, but suffice to say that Kitigawa's fashion sense is part of a subculture that is about looking ostentatious. Her colored contacts and nails are all part of her chosen aesthetic, and it's meant to be a bit over the top, but it's a personal choice that she conveys with confidence. Not only that, but Kitigawa wants to cosplay, which in itself means putting her body on display to look like a certain character and then have her photos taken. And Kitigawa, being the bizarre girl she is, wants to cosplay as a character from an erotic visual novel. She admires Shizuku's look and wants to emulate it. It goes without saying that cosplay would require a fair amount of self-confidence, and later on we see a character find her confidence by trying cosplay, but because Kitigawa specifically picks someone from a sexual novel, it's understood that she is okay with displaying her body, and not for anyone else other than herself. We even see her tally the number of times her photo is taken in the costume at the cosplay event. Those are Japanese tally marks, but why she put them on her thighs is a mystery to me. The fact that Kitigawa is openly okay with talking about her interest in erotic games also conveys her confidence.
そういうゲームは女性は敬遠してやらないと思ってました。
マジ？やるやる。普通にやるし。
In contrast, Gojo is uncomfortable when it comes to almost anything to do with sex. Which brings us to the infamous measurement episode. The majority of the second episode is taken up by Gojo needing Kitigawa's measurements so he can make her cosplay fit correctly. It's an innocuous event, as I'm sure we've all been fitted for clothing at one point or another. But because Kitigawa is so confident, she shows up in a bikini so that the costume will fit her perfectly. Gojo then spends the entirety of the episode struggling with his inability to cope with how Kitigawa's body makes him feel. It's an excellent recipe for comedy, but what makes this episode spectacular is that it's mostly an internal struggle. Kitigawa is confident in her swimwear, but Gojo can't help but notice the way it makes her look. But he doesn't want to make a big deal out of it. He comes to the conclusion that if it's not a big deal for Kitigawa, then he should relax as well and follow her lead about her body. That's pretty sex positive. But that doesn't stop him from spending the entire time flustered, although he is still respectful. I would argue that the show is deliberate in its depiction of Kitigawa's body because it's in service of her character and confidence, and it's in contrast to Gojo's lack of confidence for the purposes of comedy and character growth. Of course, you can still argue that it's all fan service, and I wouldn't disagree, but at least it's contextual in the story rather than the workings of superfluous camera angles. Kitigawa's confidence in her self-image makes a lot of sense in conjunction with her character and why she might show it off, but there's another factor in why the show might show off her body, and it has to do with Gojo. Despite the show being obsessed with Kitigawa and the fact that we sometimes get her and other characters' inner monologues, it's very clear that the show's central character is Gojo. We know that he's uncomfortable with sex, and we also know that he's intrigued and probably excited by the prospect of it, so we wind up with the possibility for conflict and character growth, especially when contrasted with Kitigawa's overt sexuality, mischievous nature, and the fact that both of the characters clearly have feelings for each other. Particularly Kitigawa, who has basically gone stupid for Gojo.
私ガチで五条くんのこと好きになってるんだけど
Gojo, for his part, clearly loves Kitigawa, even if he's the only one who hasn't realized it yet.
可愛らしいところもあって今のは違うんです
So there's real heart to the love story, but it's also part of where the sexualization comes from. I already played the clip of Kitigawa expressing interest in doing inappropriate things with Gojo.
しちゃったりして
The fact that she's in high school means it would not be unreasonable to think that she would want to or already be sexually active. Many other shows depict this, and it's a very natural thing to want.
雨が強いから今日は帰れないねこの熱が宮村に伝わればいいと思った
But in this case, it provides Kitigawa with an excuse for comedy and sexuality as she uses her body to tease Gojo. And there is once again a narrative reason for this beyond the fact that sex sells. She does this because she knows it will make him squirm, which is definitely in her character because she likes to tease Gojo in other ways. But there are other times where she's clearly trying to elicit a reaction because of her attraction to him and because it could cause him to admit his feelings for her.
着てる写真送ろっか
It's also worth considering that Kitigawa wants Gojo to desire her because who doesn't want to feel wanted?
写真送ったのに既読スルーしたでしょ何だったのあれひどくない
写真を見たら色々あったからです
So it's clear that the show is trying to do more with sexualization than just simply having it on screen. Despite the fact that the show explicitly shows Kitigawa for those reasons, they at least adhere to the story and characters. But that probably won't stop some people from not getting it. And by it, I mean that some people don't get that anime, manga, animation, cartoons, and drawings as a whole can be sexually pleasing to look at. Kitigawa, after all, is just a drawing and not real, which means it's time for one of my favorite topics in philosophy, semiotics. I talked about the semiotics of horror movies before in an episode about Paranorman, and that's a good introduction, but essentially semiotics are the study of signs. Charles Sanders Peirce decided that the way people derive meaning out of things was weird and made no sense, so he tried to figure this out and broke signs and their meanings down into 3 different classes. Symbols are things that are given 0 meaning unless you have prior knowledge of what they're supposed to represent, like the tally marks that Kitigawa takes. Unless you know what they're for and what number they signify, they don't have a meaning, even if you're Japanese. Indexes are when the meaning is related to the sign, like how the save button in most computer applications is a floppy disk. An object that was used to store data now conveys the idea of storing data. And lastly, an icon, which conveys information by resembling the object that it represents, like the way the walk sign on a traffic light looks like a human walking. You can apply these to sounds and music or television and movie tropes, but for today I'm most interested in icons and visual art. All human cartoon characters are icons as they're made to resemble what humans look like in order to tell stories about humans. Psychologically, humans love to give anything from animals to objects human-like characteristics, but what I'm talking about is how the resemblance to humans changes the way we think about that object, which raises some really neat questions about how much an icon has to resemble the thing it signifies. For instance, anime characters have often been maligned for unrealistic facial features, particularly the eyes, but despite this, the characters are icons, and are still understood to be human people. And yes, this is very important because the reason people are attracted to Kitigawa's fictional features, or Gojo's if that's what you're into, is because she resembles all of the features that are traditionally desirable in a woman's body, and is therefore an icon of an attractive woman, a sex icon if you will. But of course there will always be the argument that she's only a representation of what an actual woman looks like. Well yes, she's only drawn, but that doesn't stop her from being attractive. The fact that she has unrealistic features, and I'm not talking about her figure, but the design choices of the art and aesthetic that she's a part of, is actually really important, because if she were to look too much like a human, she may run the risk of ceasing to be an icon of a person and fall into the uncanny valley. She'd be too close to looking like an actual human without being close enough and wind up in this weird, freaky artistic space that's uncomfortable to look at. And if they still tried to make her sexy, it might have the opposite effect and come across as gross or disgusting, or result in a very strange kind of arousal. I'm not here to kink shame. But the representational and aesthetic features of the art form keep Kitigawa firmly as an icon of attractive woman without needing to look exactly like one. And that's why she can be a cartoon character, but still be sexually attractive. It's like how Jessica Rabbit is the epitome of traditional female sexuality, but if you saw someone in real life who actually looked like that, You'd set that shit on fire! So I think it's totally fine that Kitigawa is attractive. There's nothing wrong with the representation of an attractive woman through her iconicity. And on top of that, her character is treated with respect, even though she's sexual. The fact that My Dress-Up Darling spends most of its time crafting a wonderful story of joy and love between exceedingly likable and lifelike characters makes for a really fantastic watch. The sexual nature of the show is due to specific characters' relationship with themselves, each other, and how they understand sex. This allows the show to show off its characters in a way that treats them autonomously, while still allowing them to be hyper-sexualized representations of people without undermining them. The characters are shown in relation to sex and treat sex differently depending on their comfort level, and we the audience can appreciate both the visually pleasing parts and the emotional narrative parts, while safe in the knowledge that there's nothing wrong with enjoying an icon of feminine or masculine attractiveness. Actually, I'm more weirded out by the fact that these characters are high schoolers than I am about them being animated. But either way, this is one of the best examples of sex and story working together with one another as representations of physically attractive and well-rounded characters, rather than a depiction of sex being used as a means to sell the show to the detriment of its plot. And that is why My Dress-Up Darling is both extremely horny and exceedingly wholesome. Here are my stray thoughts. Another example of media that plays with these ideas of sexualization and story to bolster its themes is the video game Catherine, but it uses sex in the more traditionally sultry and taboo way, so I think My Dress-Up Darling actually subverts a lot of stereotypes around sex and gender roles, such as the fact that Gojo is interested in traditionally domestic arts and Kitigawa is bad at them, or her outgoing personality compared to his shy one. As of the writing of the script, the show is not yet over, so I hope they get together, and I hope that the show is popular enough we can get another season. And yes, it is because I like the plot. Hey! Thanks so much for watching that episode. I really enjoyed talking about My Dress-Up Darling, and it's a really intriguing show, and not just for the obvious sex reasons. I also showed a clip of Horimiya, so let me know if you really enjoyed that show too, because it was kind of an interesting look at high school romance as well. Be sure to check out our other channel, the Cinemasters, for more conversations about movies and TV shows. You can help the channel grow by clicking that like button and subscribe so you'll never miss another episode of This Is a Thing, the long and the short of it, and lots of other really cool stuff happening right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.